Miss Marple and Lady Bantry's last garden party. Welcome to Cafe Tales. Tonight's story begins. But before we dive in, thank you for being here with us. I'm your host, Ailey, and isn't it wonderful how these mysteries bring us together from all corners of the world? Leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from. I read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe for new stories every day. Now, let's begin the mystery. Chapter 1. Invitations and the Last Party. The morning post at Gossington Hall arrived as it always did at precisely 8:30. Lady Bantry, known to her intimates as Dolly, sat at the breakfast table in her favorite chintz morning gown, her gray hair still showing traces of the auburn it had once been. The July sunshine streamed through the long windows of the breakfast room, casting dancing patterns across the correspondence scattered before her. "I'm being sentimental," she announced to no one in particular, for she had long ago developed the habit of speaking her thoughts aloud in the empty house. The butler, Lawrence, had grown accustomed to these pronouncements, and merely inclined his head respectfully as he refilled her coffee cup. Lady Bantry held up an elegant cream invitation card, examining her own careful handwriting. "The last garden party at Gossington Hall," she read aloud. "How terribly dramatic that sounds. But one must be practical, mustn't one, Lawrence?" "Indeed, my lady," Lawrence replied, though his tone suggested he found the entire notion of disposing of Gossington Hall rather distressing. The truth was, Dolly Bantry had reached a crossroads. The great house, with its 17 rooms and magnificent Italian gardens, had become rather too much for one elderly widow, however sprightly she might appear. Her arthritis had been troubling her more of late, particularly in the damp corners of the house, and the expense of maintaining the peacock topiary and formal borders was becoming prohibitive. Two very different solutions had presented themselves. The National Trust had expressed interest in taking over the property, complete with its historical significance and architectural merit. Alternatively, a development company represented by the persuasive Mr. Lionel Stratton had made what they termed a very generous modern offer for the estate, with plans to create what they called a progressive residential development with contemporary amenities. One more party, Dolly decided the previous week. One last proper celebration while everything is still as Arthur and I made it. Then I shall decide which future Gossington shall have. The guest list represented a careful selection of old friends and interested parties. Miss Jane Marple, of course, would be essential. Despite her advancing years, she remained the most engaging conversationalist in St. Mary Mead, with her gentle observations and uncanny ability to see through people's pretenses. The local worthies would attend: Dr. Haydock with his gruff manner and kind heart, the Reverend Leonard Clement and his vivacious wife Griselda, and Mrs. Nora Pike from the village. More intriguingly, Dolly had also invited those whose futures might be affected by her decision. Mr. Lionel Stratton himself would be present. Naturally, along with Miss Mirabelle Shaw, the fashionable garden designer who had been making rather pointed suggestions about modernizing the grounds. Mr. Sims, the head gardener who attended to Gossington's borders for 30 years, would oversee the grounds during the party, though Dolly suspected he would spend much of his time glowering at anyone who suggested changes to his beloved gardens. Mrs. Knight, the housekeeper, had been in charge of Gossington's domestic arrangements for nearly as long as Sims tended the gardens. She possessed the peculiar ability to make guests feel both completely welcome and slightly guilty for disturbing the household routine. Then there was Robert Bantry, Arthur's nephew, who had inherited his uncle's charm, if not his financial acumen. Robert had been hinting rather broadly that he hoped his aunt might consider family obligations when making her decision about the estate. His debts, Dolly suspected, were mounting faster than his income could manage. The party was planned for the afternoon of July 28th, with festivities beginning at 3 o'clock. A string quartet had been engaged to play on the lower lawn, and refreshments would be served on the terrace. Dolly had specifically requested that speeches be kept to a minimum, though she had agreed to allow Mr. Stratton a brief address at 4 by the sundial, where he could outline his vision for Gossington's future. As the morning progressed, the household preparations intensified. Mrs. Knight supervised the polishing of silver and the pressing of linens with military precision. In the kitchens, cook muttered over elaborate preparations for cucumber sandwiches, seed cake, and the crystal bowls that would hold summer fruits. Meanwhile, in the gardens, Mr. Sims directed the final preparations with the intensity of a general preparing for battle. The peacock topiary, his particular pride, had been trimmed to perfection. The herbaceous borders blazed with delphiniums, hollyhocks, and roses in their midsummer glory. The great stone urns that decorated the balustrade of the Italian terrace had been cleaned and planted with trailing geraniums and ivy. It was these urns that caught Miss Marple's attention when she arrived early at 2 to offer her assistance with any last-minute preparations. She had walked over from her cottage in the village, enjoying the warm afternoon and the familiar path through the woods that bordered Gossington's grounds. "How lovely everything looks." "Dolly," she said, accepting a glass of lemonade on the terrace, "those urns are particularly magnificent. Such substantial pieces." Lady Bantry beamed with pride. "Arthur had them brought from Italy in 1923. Carrara marble," he insisted on. "Nothing but the best for Gossington's terrace, though I must say they do seem rather precarious up there on the balustrade. I sometimes wonder about the wisdom of having such heavy pieces in such an exposed position." Miss Marple approached the western urn, the larger of the two, and examined it with the careful attention she might give to a particularly interesting piece of needlework. The urn stood about 4 feet high, its classical lines enhanced by carved garlands and a wide, shallow bowl at the top. It was indeed magnificent, but as she looked closer, Miss Marple noticed something curious. The marble base of the urn, where it rested on the stone balustrade, showed a faint clean streak, as if someone had recently wiped it with a cloth. More intriguingly, when she placed her hand gently against the side of the urn and gave the slightest pressure, she felt an almost imperceptible movement. "How very odd," she murmured to herself, then smiled and returned to her lemonade as the first guests began to arrive. By 4 o'clock, the party was in full swing. The string quartet played selections from light opera, while guests strolled between the terrace and the lower lawn, admiring the gardens and speculating about Gossington's future. Mr. Stratton moved among the company with practiced ease, his manner suggesting confidence in his eventual success. Miss Marple, settled comfortably in a garden chair with her knitting, watched the social currents with the benevolent interest of an experienced observer. She noted how Miss Shaw photographed various aspects of the garden with particular attention to what she termed development possibilities, and how young Robert Bantry seemed unusually nervous, constantly checking his pocket watch. As 4 approached, Lady Bantry called for attention. "Mr. Stratton will address the company from the sundial on the lower lawn," she announced, "where everyone can hear him properly." The guests gathered expectantly as Stratton descended from the terrace, positioning himself directly beneath the western urn for maximum theatrical effect. He raised his glass in a toast to their hostess. It was then that Miss Marple noticed the urn give what seemed to be a small settling lurch. A moment later, with a grinding sound of stone against stone, the great marble urn toppled from its perch and crashed down onto the lawn below. Chapter 2. An Urn on the Terrace. The silence that followed the crash was profound and terrible. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the assembled guests stood frozen like figures in a tableau. Their faces turned toward the spot where Lionel Stratton had been standing only seconds before. Then the screaming began. It was Griselda Clement who broke first, her voice rising in a sharp cry that seemed to release everyone else from their paralysis. Lady Bantry swayed where she stood on the terrace, her face draining of all color until she appeared almost as marble pale as the broken urn that now lay in fragments across the lower lawn. "Good God," breathed the Reverend Clement, moving swiftly toward the scene of the accident. "Someone telephone for Dr. Haydock at once." "No need," came a grim voice from behind them. Dr. Haydock himself stepped forward, his medical bag already in hand. He had been examining the roses near the garden wall when the urn fell, and his professional training had immediately taken precedence over social niceties. "Stand back, everyone. Give me room to work." But even as he knelt beside the motionless form of Stratton, his experienced hands checking for vital signs that he knew he would not find, Haydock's expression told its own story. The estate agent lay crumpled beneath the largest piece of the shattered urn, his glass still clutched in his right hand, the contents spreading a dark stain across the immaculate lawn. Miss Marple, who had risen from her chair the moment she saw the urn begin its fatal descent, now moved with surprising swiftness for a woman of her years, while the other guests clustered together in shocked groups, speaking in hushed, horrified whispers. She approached the scene with the quiet purposefulness of someone who understood that important details might be lost if not observed immediately. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done," Dr. Haydock said quietly, getting to his feet and brushing dust from his knees. "Death was instantaneous. The blow to the skull." He shook his head gravely. "A mercy, really. He would have felt nothing." Inspector Slack arrived within 20 minutes, summoned by Lawrence, who had telephoned the police station with commendable presence of mind. The inspector was a solid, practical man who had learned over the years to approach unusual deaths in St. Mary Mead with a certain weary resignation. Where Miss Marple lived, simple accidents had a tendency to become complicated. "Right then," Slack announced, surveying the scene with professional thoroughness. "Everyone stay exactly where they are until I've had a chance to speak with each of you. This appears to be a straightforward accident, but procedure must be followed." He examined the fallen urn with the careful attention of a man who had investigated his share of unusual deaths. The great marble piece had split into several large fragments, the largest of which had struck Stratton directly. The base, where it had been fixed to the balustrade, showed clear signs of deteriorated mortar. "Old houses, Lady Bantry," Slack said sympathetically, noting the elderly woman's distress. "These things happen. The mortar gives way, especially in hot weather like we've been having. Expands and contracts, you see, weakens the bonds." Lady Bantry nodded mutely, accepting a chair that Mrs. Knight had hastily brought from the terrace. The housekeeper hovered protectively nearby, her usual composure shaken by the tragedy that had befallen her mistress's party. "Had you noticed any problems with the urn before today?" Slack inquired gently. "No, Inspector," Lady Bantry managed. "That is, I don't believe so. Mr. Sims would know better than I about such matters. He maintains all the stonework in the gardens." The head gardener stepped forward, his weathered features creased with concern and what appeared to be professional embarrassment. "I checked those urns myself not 3 days past, Inspector," he said firmly. "They were solid as could be. I'd stake my reputation on it." Slack made a note in his book. "Well, Mr. Sims, I'm afraid your reputation may need some staking. These things don't just fall without cause. When did you last examine the mortar?" Sims bristled slightly at the implied criticism. "I tamped fresh mortar around the base of that very urn yesterday morning, Inspector. Standard maintenance, you understand. I've been tending these gardens for 30 years, and I know my business." While this exchange continued, Miss Marple had been conducting her own quiet examination of the accident scene. She moved with the unobtrusive skill of someone who had learned that the most important observations were often made while others were focused elsewhere. Kneeling carefully beside the broken base of the urn, she withdrew a small handkerchief from her sleeve and gently dabbed at something on the underside lip of the marble base. To the casual observer, she might have been merely removing dust or debris. In fact, she was collecting a tiny amber-colored tear of what appeared to be wax. Such a tragedy, she murmured to herself, carefully folding the handkerchief and returning it to her sleeve, and on such a beautiful afternoon. The other guests had begun to recover from the initial shock, though their conversations remained subdued, and their glances frequently returned to the cordoned area, where Stratton's body lay covered by a tablecloth from the refreshment table. The quartet had packed away their instruments and departed, their music seeming suddenly inappropriate to the circumstances. Mirabelle Shaw stood near the sundial, her camera hanging forgotten around her neck, her usual professional composure clearly shaken. "It's simply dreadful," she said to anyone who would listen. Poor Mr. Stratton was so enthusiastic about his plans for modernizing the estate. He was going to transform this place into something truly contemporary. Robert Bantry paced nervously near the terrace steps, checking his pocket watch repeatedly, as if the passage of time might somehow undo the afternoon's tragic events. "Aunt Dolly," he said anxiously, "perhaps you should go inside. This has been a terrible shock." But Lady Bantry, though pale and obviously distressed, showed no inclination to abandon her guests in their hour of need. "Nonsense. Robert," she said with a ghost of her usual brisk manner, "one doesn't flee from tragedy. These people came here as my guests, and I shall see that they are properly looked after, accident or no accident." Mrs. Knight appeared at her elbow with a small glass of brandy. "For the shock, my lady," she said quietly. "Doctor's orders." She cast a meaningful glance toward Dr. Haydock, who nodded his approval. As the inspector continued his preliminary investigation, photographing the scene and taking statements from the witnesses, Miss Marple withdrew to a quiet corner of the terrace, where she could observe without being observed. Her knitting needles clicked softly as she worked, but her eyes remained alert to every nuance of behavior among the shaken guests. She had noticed several small details that struck her as curious. The position where Stratton had chosen to stand, for instance, seemed deliberately calculated to place him directly beneath the urn. Most speakers would have positioned themselves on the terrace itself, or at least to one side of the sundial, where they could address their audience without standing in what amounted to a potential impact zone. Then there was the matter of the timing. The urn had begun to shift just as Stratton raised his glass in a toast. If the mortar had been gradually deteriorating, what had caused it to fail at that precise moment? Most intriguing of all was the small substance she had collected from the urn's base. It had the appearance and consistency of beeswax. But what would beeswax be doing on a marble balustrade? "Such a puzzle," she murmured to herself, her needles continuing their steady rhythm, though perhaps not quite the puzzle it appears to be. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant more sharply across the terrace, casting longer shadows and highlighting details that had been less obvious in the bright light of midday. Miss Marple found herself studying the remaining urn on the eastern side of the balustrade, comparing its position and stability with what she remembered of its fallen companion. Inspector Slack approached with a chair. Notebook in hand. "Miss Marple," he said respectfully, "I understand you witnessed the accident. Could you tell me exactly what you observed?" Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with the mild expression that had often caused people to underestimate her powers of observation. "Certainly. Inspector," she said pleasantly, "though I'm afraid there may be rather more to observe than one might initially suppose." Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices Beeswax. The guests had finally been dismissed after Inspector Slack completed his preliminary interviews, though not before he had extracted promises from each of them to remain available for further questioning, should it prove necessary. The general consensus among the departing visitors was that poor Mr. Stratton had been the victim of a most unfortunate accident, the sort of thing that might happen in any old house where time and weather had taken their toll on ancient stonework. Miss Marple, however, had lingered at Gossington Hall under the pretense of assisting Lady Bantry through the immediate aftermath of the tragedy. In truth, her interest lay in examining certain peculiarities that had caught her attention during the confusion following the accident. "My dear Dolly," she said gently, settling her hostess in the morning room with a cup of tea, "you mustn't blame yourself for what happened. These old houses can be treacherous, and there was no way you could have foreseen such an occurrence." Lady Bantry stared into a teacup with unseeing eyes. "But I should have known, Jane. I should have had those urns properly inspected. Arthur always said one couldn't be too careful with the stonework." She looked up suddenly, her expression stricken. "Whatever shall I tell Mr. Stratton's firm? They'll think I'm a careless old woman who can't maintain her property." "I shouldn't worry about that just yet," Miss Marple replied soothingly. "These matters have a way of sorting themselves out, given time." She paused, her fingers working automatically with her knitting. "I wonder, my dear, could you tell me what substances are typically used about the house for cleaning and maintenance? I'm particularly curious about waxes and polishes." Lady Bantry looked puzzled by the seemingly random question. "Waxes? Well, Mrs. Knight uses paraffin wax for the silver, I believe, and linseed oil for the wood furniture. Why do you ask?" "Oh, merely idle curiosity," Miss Marple said mildly. "I noticed during the excitement that there seemed to be some sort of waxy residue on the fallen urn, and I wondered what it might be." "How very observant of you, Jane. I confess I noticed nothing of the sort, though I was rather distracted by the circumstances." Lady Bantry frowned thoughtfully. "The only beeswax we keep is in the potting shed, I believe. Mr. Sims uses it for grafting tape and such gardening applications. There are also the beekeepers, of course, down by the kitchen garden." Miss Marple's needles clicked with particular satisfaction. Beeswax. Yes, that would make sense. Such a useful substance for gardening purposes, I'm sure. After ensuring that Lady Bantry was settled and had Mrs. Knight to attend to her needs, Miss Marple excused herself for a brief constitutional around the gardens. The late afternoon sun was casting long, dramatic shadows across the formal borders, and most of the household staff had withdrawn to deal with the aftermath of the interrupted party. She made her way first to the terrace, where the remaining urn stood in solitary splendor on the eastern side of the balustrade. The contrast with its fallen companion was marked, and Miss Marple examined its base carefully, noting how securely it was fixed to the stonework. There was no sign of the waxy substance she had found on the other urn. Turning her attention to the scene of the accident, she observed that Inspector Slack's men had been thorough in their examination of the debris. The fragments of marble had been photographed and measured, and the area where Stratton had fallen was marked with chalk. Yet in their focus on the obvious evidence, they had overlooked some of the subtler details that interested Miss Marple. On the rim of the largest piece of the broken urn, she discovered what she'd been looking for. 2 ivy leaves, still clinging to a tendril that had been trailing from the urn's planted bowl, showed a peculiar browning along one edge. It was not the natural browning of autumn or disease, but something more specific. The edges looked singed, as if they had been exposed to concentrated heat. Miss Marple examined the leaves more closely, her experienced eye noting the precise line where the browning occurred. It was almost as if something very hot had passed close enough to scorch the foliage without actually touching it. "Most curious," she murmured to herself, carefully detaching one of the affected leaves and wrapping it in a spare handkerchief. Her next destination was the balustrade itself, where the fallen urn had stood. The stonework showed clear signs of recent disturbance, with fresh mortar dust scattered, about and a conspicuous gap where the marble base had once rested. But what caught Miss Marple's attention was a tiny greasy mark on the stone surface, barely visible, unless one knew exactly where to look. She dampened a corner of her handkerchief with water from the fountain and gently cleaned the mark. The residue on the cloth confirmed her suspicions. A yellowish, waxy substance that had the distinctive smell and consistency of beeswax. The curious thing was the location of this mark. It was not where one would expect to find maintenance residue from normal cleaning or repair work. Instead, it appeared to be precisely positioned at the point where something might have been temporarily attached to hold the urn in a particular position. Miss Marple spent several more minutes examining the immediate area, her keen eyes searching for any other anomalous details. She found them in unexpected places, tiny clues that told a story quite different from the simple accident that everyone assumed had occurred. As she made her way toward the potting shed, Miss Marple reflected on what she had observed. The beeswax was the key. She felt certain. In her experience, substances did not appear in unlikely places without reason, and beeswax had no business being present on a marble balustrade unless someone had placed it there deliberately. The potting shed stood at the far end of the kitchen garden, a substantial wooden structure where Mr. Sims kept his tools and supplies. The door was unlocked, as was customary during the day, and Miss Marple entered quietly, breathing in the familiar scent of earth, seed compost, and the various preparations used in maintaining a gentleman's garden. The interior was meticulously organized, with tools hung in precise arrangements and supplies stored in labeled containers. Mr. Sims was clearly a man who took pride in his work and maintained his domain with military precision. On the main workbench, however, Miss Marple noticed something that struck her as odd. In the thin layer of dust that covered the wooden surface, there was a distinct circular mark, clean and fresh, where something round had recently been placed and then removed. The circle was approximately the diameter of a large bell jar or garden cloche. She examined the mark more closely, noting that the dust displacement suggested whatever had been placed there was both heavy and recently handled. Around the edges of the circle, she detected faint traces of the same waxy residue she had found on the balustrade. Nearby, hanging from a hook on the wall, was a gardener's magnifying glass of the type used for examining plant diseases or for concentrating sunlight to light fires or burn away pests. The leather sleeve that protected the lens showed signs of recent handling, with finger marks in the dust that had not yet had time to settle. Miss Marple lifted the magnifying glass carefully, noting its weight and the quality of its lens. It was a substantial piece of equipment capable of focusing sunlight into an intense beam of considerable heat. In the right hands and with proper timing, such an instrument could certainly generate enough concentrated warmth to affect a small quantity of beeswax. She replaced the magnifying glass thoughtfully and continued her examination of the shed. In one corner, she found a collection of glass cloches used for protecting tender plants. Most were arranged in orderly rows, but one position was conspicuously empty, with only a dust outline to show where a cloche had recently stood. "Most illuminating," Miss Marple murmured, though there was no one present to hear her observation. As she prepared to leave the potting shed, she noticed Mr. Sims approaching across the kitchen garden, his expression one of mild suspicion at finding a guest in his private domain. "Miss Marple," he said, touching his cap respectfully, but with obvious concern. "Is there something I can help you with?" "This has been a terrible day for all of us." "Indeed it has, Mr. Sims," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "I was merely admiring your excellent organization. Such a well-maintained facility speaks volumes about the care you take with Lady Bantry's gardens." Sims's chest swelled slightly with professional pride, though his suspicion remained evident. 30 years I've been tending these grounds, Miss Marple. I know every plant, every stone, every tool, Nothing happens in these gardens without my knowledge. Miss Marple smiled gently. I'm quite sure that's true, Mr. Sims, though I wonder, have you noticed any of your equipment being moved or borrowed recently? Garden cloches, perhaps, or other implements? The gardener's expression darkened. Now that you mention it, miss, I have noticed some irregularities. My cloches don't go wandering about on their own, and I found one of them out of place in the kitchen garden this very afternoon. Most irregular, especially on a day when we were entertaining guests. Chapter 4. A Glass Ring in the Dust. Miss Marple's conversation with Mr. Sims had proved most enlightening, though she suspected the head gardener was unaware of just how significant his observations had been. As she made her way back through the kitchen garden, she paused to examine the displaced cloche he had mentioned, finding it standing rather forlornly among the tomato plants where it clearly did not belong. The glass bell was approximately 18 inches in diameter, its surface bearing faint smudges that caught the late afternoon light. When Miss Marple bent to examine these marks more closely, her suspicions were confirmed. The same waxy residue that had appeared on the balustrade and in the potting shed was present here as well, though in such minute quantities that only the most careful observer would have noticed it. Someone has been very busy indeed, she murmured, noting how the cloche had been positioned with a clear view toward the terrace. The angle was quite deliberate, she felt certain, calculated to achieve a specific purpose that had nothing to do with protecting delicate plants from the elements. The shadows were lengthening as she returned to the main house, where she found Lady Bantry in the library, attempting to compose a letter to Mr. Stratton's business partners. The task appeared to be causing her considerable distress, as evidenced by the several crumpled sheets of paper scattered around the writing desk. My dear Dolly, Miss Marple said gently, settling herself in a nearby chair. Surely such correspondence can wait until tomorrow. You've had quite enough to contend with for one day. Lady Bantry looked up with relief. You're quite right, of course. I simply cannot find the proper words. How does one explain that a guest has been killed by falling masonry at what was meant to be a celebration? She set down her pen with a gesture of defeat. Inspector Slack seems convinced it was merely an unfortunate accident, but I cannot help feeling responsible. I shouldn't be too hasty in accepting simple explanations, Miss Marple observed mildly, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. In my experience, accidents often prove to be rather more complicated than they initially appear. Lady Bantry studied her friend's placid expression with growing interest. Jane, you've been unusually thorough in your examination of the gardens this afternoon. Have you discovered something that the inspector might have overlooked? Miss Marple smiled in her gentle way. Merely some inconsistencies that puzzle me, my dear. Nothing that couldn't have perfectly innocent explanations, of course. Though I must say the timing of events this afternoon strikes me as remarkably precise for a random mechanical failure. Before Lady Bantry could inquire further, Mrs. Knight appeared in the doorway, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. Begging your pardon? My lady, but there's been another small incident. Nothing serious, she added hastily, seeing her employer's alarmed expression. But I thought you should know that someone has been interfering with the arrangements in the potting shed. Interfering how? Lady Bantry asked. Mr. Sims is quite upset, my lady. Apparently, several of his tools have been moved about, and one of the garden cloches is missing from its proper place. He's most particular about his equipment, as you know. Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Lady Bantry. How very inconvenient for Mr. Sims. I don't suppose anyone was observed in the vicinity of the potting shed during the party. Mrs. Knight considered this carefully. Well, now that you mention it, miss, I did notice Mr. Robert showing someone about the grounds before lunch. Young people today seem to find the most peculiar things entertaining. He was demonstrating how to light a cigarette using that old magnifying glass Mr. Sims keeps for examining plants. How resourceful of him, Miss Marple commented. And who was the recipient of this educational demonstration? I couldn't say for certain, miss, but I believe it was one of the guests. A young lady, though I was too busy with the preparations to pay close attention. After Mrs. Knight had withdrawn, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the increasing complexity of the afternoon's events. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that Mr. Stratton's death had been anything but accidental. The pattern of evidence suggested careful planning and precise execution, qualities that were rarely associated with structural failures in ancient masonry. Dolly, she said eventually, I wonder if you could tell me more about the people who were present today, particularly those who might have had reason to be concerned about Mr. Stratton's plans for Gossington. Lady Bantry settled back in her chair, apparently grateful for a distraction from her correspondence. Well, there's Miss Shaw, of course. Mirabelle Shaw. She's been quite persistent in her suggestions about modernizing the gardens. I understand she was hoping to secure the commission for redesigning the grounds if the development proposal went forward. And would Mr. Stratton's death affect such an arrangement? I should think it might complicate matters considerably. His firm was most enthusiastic about their plans, but without his personal involvement. Lady Bantry trailed off thoughtfully. Miss Shaw seemed rather agitated when she learned that the National Trust was also being considered. Apparently, their approach would preserve the gardens essentially as they are, which would leave little scope for her particular talents. Miss Marple absorbed this information with interest. Professional disappointment had certainly provided motives for murder in the past, though she had learned to be cautious about assuming too direct a connection between opportunity and guilt. What about your nephew, Robert? She inquired delicately. I imagine he has opinions about Gossington's future as well. Lady Bantry's expression grew troubled. Poor Robert has been rather indiscreet in expressing his hopes that I might consider family obligations when making my decision. He's developed some unfortunate financial habits, I'm afraid, and seems to believe that inheriting Gossington would solve his difficulties, and Mr. Stratton's development proposal would presumably have generated considerably more immediate capital than a transfer to the National Trust. Precisely. Though I must say Robert lacks the practical knowledge to execute any sort of sophisticated scheme. He's charming enough, but rather hopeless when it comes to anything requiring careful planning or technical skill. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. What about the household staff? Mr. Sims and Mrs. Knight have both been with you for many years, I believe. 30 years for Sims, 28 for Mrs. Knight. They're both utterly devoted to Gossington, though in rather different ways. Sims views any change to the gardens as a personal affront, while Mrs. Knight simply loathes having strangers disrupting her carefully maintained routines. The conversation was interrupted by a discreet knock at the library door. Lawrence entered bearing a silver tray with the Evening Post. The second delivery. My lady, he announced, presenting the tray with his customary dignity. Among the letters was a telegram which Lady Bantry opened with some trepidation. After the day's events, she seemed to expect only bad news. How very peculiar, she said after reading the brief message. It's from Mr. Stratton's office in London. They're inquiring about the status of his presentation today and asking when they might expect his report on the meeting's outcome. Miss Marple's needles paused in their clicking. They haven't been informed of the accident? Apparently not. But that's not the strange part, Jane. According to this telegram, Mr. Stratton was supposed to return to London this evening with signed preliminary agreements. He seems to have been far more confident about the success of his proposal than he led anyone to believe. Miss Marple resumed her knitting with renewed interest. Indeed, that does cast his afternoon's performance in rather a different light, doesn't it? I wonder what gave him such confidence in his eventual success. As evening settled over Gossington Hall, Miss Marple found herself reviewing the accumulating evidence with growing certainty that they were dealing not with an accident, but with a carefully orchestrated crime. The question that remained was identifying which of the afternoon's guests had possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to arrange such an elaborate deception. The answer, she suspected, lay in understanding exactly how the murder had been accomplished, and more importantly, why the timing had been so crucial to its success. Chapter 5. Place Cards That Wandered. The following morning dawned clear and bright, with a sort of crystalline air that often follows dramatic events, as if nature itself were attempting to restore order after human chaos. Miss Marple arrived at Gossington Hall shortly after breakfast, ostensibly to check on Lady Bantry's welfare, but in reality to pursue certain inquiries that had occurred to her during a restless night. She found her hostess in the morning room, looking considerably more composed than she had the previous evening, though the strain of recent events was evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. "My dear Jane," Lady Bantry said, rising to greet her visitor. "How thoughtful of you to call so early. I confess I slept rather poorly, with all manner of disturbing thoughts running through my mind." "Perfectly understandable, my dear," Miss Marple replied, accepting the offered chair and producing her inevitable knitting from her capacious handbag. "Tragic events have a way of unsettling one's mental equilibrium, even when logic suggests there's nothing more to be done." As they settled into conversation over tea and toast, Miss Marple steered the discussion toward the previous day's arrangements. "I was admiring the careful organization of your party yesterday," she remarked casually. "Such attention to detail in the placement of guests for the speeches and photographs. I noticed there were little name cards by the sundial." Lady Bantry looked puzzled. "Name cards? I'm afraid I don't recall arranging anything of that sort, Jane. Though perhaps Mrs. Knight or one of the others took that initiative." "Oh, how interesting," Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking thoughtfully. "I distinctly remember seeing several cards positioned near the sundial area, apparently to indicate where various people should stand for Mr. Stratton's address. I assumed it was part of your careful planning." Before Lady Bantry could respond, Mrs. Knight appeared with fresh tea and the morning's correspondence. Miss Marple seized the opportunity to make a delicate inquiry. "Mrs. Knight, I was just mentioning to Lady Bantry the name cards that were placed near the sundial yesterday. Such thoughtful organization for the speeches." The housekeeper's expression showed mild confusion. "Name cards, miss? I arranged no such thing. My responsibilities were confined to the refreshments and indoor preparations." "How very curious," Miss Marple observed. "Perhaps one of the guests took it upon themselves to organize the positioning. I recall seeing Mrs. Pike adjusting some cards just before the speeches began." This prompted Lady Bantry to send for Mrs. Pike, who arrived within the hour, still visibly shaken by the previous day's tragedy, but eager to assist with any inquiries. "Oh yes, Miss Marple," she confirmed, settling herself carefully in the offered chair. There were indeed little cards near the sundial. Most peculiar arrangement, I thought at the time. I found Mr. Stratton's card placed at the very center of the area, directly beneath that dreadful urn." "And you moved it?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "Well, not exactly moved it, miss. I noticed that Lady Bantry's card had somehow been displaced to one side, so I simply switched them back to what seemed the proper positions. After all, it was Lady Bantry's party, and she should have had the place of honor for any photographs or speeches." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest. "How very considerate of you, Mrs. Pike. And you say Mr. Stratton's card was originally positioned in the center?" "Precisely in the center, miss, and directly in line with that massive urn. It seemed rather dangerous to me even before the accident occurred. I remember thinking that if anything were to fall from the terrace, that particular spot would be the most vulnerable." After Mrs. Pike departed, Miss Marple requested permission to examine the sundial area more closely. Lady Bantry accompanied her, curious about this unusual interest in what seemed like trivial details. The sundial stood on a circular base of weathered stone, surrounded by a small paved area where guests might gather for outdoor speeches or entertainment. Miss Marple searched carefully among the flagstones until she found what she was looking for. 2 small pieces of cream-colored cardboard, apparently overlooked during the previous day's cleanup. The cards bore names written in pencil, and Miss Marple examined them with the careful attention of a scholar studying ancient manuscripts. Both showed evidence of having been erased and rewritten, with faint impression marks visible beneath the final inscriptions. "Most illuminating," she murmured, holding one card to the light. The original writing appears to have been in the same hand as the corrections, but the positioning has clearly been altered. Lady Bantry peered over her shoulder. "I can barely make out the eraser marks, Jane. You have remarkably keen eyesight for such faint impressions." "Years of examining fine needlework, my dear. One develops an eye for subtle variations in texture and pattern." Miss Marple carefully wrapped the cards in her handkerchief. "I wonder, do you happen to know whose handwriting this might be? The style is quite distinctive, very neat and controlled." They were interrupted by the approach of Mirabelle Shaw, who had apparently been walking in the gardens and noticed their presence near the sundial. The garden designer looked considerably less polished than she had the previous day, her usual professional composure replaced by an air of nervous distraction. "Lady Bantry," she called out as she approached, "I hope you don't mind my returning so early. I realized I had left my portfolio in the house yesterday. What with all the confusion after the accident. Of course." "Miss Shaw," Lady Bantry replied politely, though Miss Marple detected a certain coolness in her manner. "I believe Lawrence placed any forgotten items in the morning room." Miss Shaw's gaze fell on the cards in Miss Marple's hands, and her expression showed a flicker of something that might have been recognition or concern. "Finding souvenirs of yesterday's tragedy?" she asked with forced lightness. "I suppose there will be morbid curiosity about every detail of the accident." "Not souvenirs," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Merely evidence of the remarkable attention to detail that someone paid to the afternoon's arrangements. These placement cards, for instance, show considerable thought in their preparation." Miss Shaw stepped closer, studying the cards with what appeared to be professional interest. "Oh yes, the positioning markers. I remember suggesting to someone that it might be useful to indicate where people should stand for the best photographic composition. The view from the terrace toward the sundial is particularly attractive." "How thoughtful of you," Miss Marple observed. "And did you actually prepare these cards yourself?" "I may have sketched out a few suggestions," Miss Shaw replied carefully, "though I'm sure others contributed to the final arrangements. One hardly remembers such minor details in the aftermath of such a tragedy." Miss Marple nodded understandingly, though she made a mental note of the designer's evident familiarity with the cards and her admission of involvement in their placement. After Miss Shaw had retrieved her portfolio and departed, Miss Marple and Lady Bantry returned to the house, where Miss Marple requested the loan of some writing materials. "I should like to compare these pencil markings with some samples. If you don't mind, Dolly. Handwriting can be quite revealing, particularly when someone has taken care to disguise their natural style." Lady Bantry provided paper and pencils, and Miss Marple spent several minutes making careful notations, comparing the formation of letters and the pressure of the pencil strokes. Her conclusion, when she reached it, was both definitive and troubling. "The same hand wrote both the original positions and the corrections," she announced. "Someone deliberately placed Mr. Stratton in that precise location, knowing full well what the consequences might be." Lady Bantry stared at the evidence with growing alarm. "Are you suggesting that someone actually planned for the urn to fall on him?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, that yesterday's accident was considerably more calculated than anyone has yet realized. The question now is determining exactly how such a plan was executed, and more importantly, who possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to carry it out. As if summoned by her words, Inspector Slack appeared at the morning room door, his expression bearing the weary resignation of a man who had hoped for a simple conclusion to what was proving to be an increasingly complex case. Chapter 6: The Burning Glass from the Potting Shed. Inspector Slack entered the morning room with the measured tread of a man who had learned to approach Miss Marple's investigations with cautious respect. Over the years, he had discovered that her seemingly innocent observations often led to uncomfortable revelations about cases he had initially dismissed as straightforward. "Good morning, Lady Bantry, Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat and settling his substantial frame into the offered chair. "I've come to inform you that the preliminary examination has been completed. The coroner is satisfied that Mr. Stratton's death was accidental, caused by the failure of deteriorated mortar in the balustrade." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with mild interest. "How very efficient of the coroner, Inspector, though I wonder whether his examination included consideration of these rather curious placement cards we've just discovered." She handed him the 2 pieces of cardboard, explaining their significance with the patient thoroughness of a schoolmistress instructing a particularly slow pupil. Inspector Slack examined the evidence with growing unease, his professional instincts warring with his desire for a simple resolution. "Well now," he said eventually, "this does put a different complexion on matters, doesn't it? Though I suppose it's possible that someone simply wanted to ensure proper positioning for photographs without any sinister intent." "Quite possible," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, "though rather unlikely, given the precision with which Mr. Stratton was placed directly beneath the most unstable urn on the terrace. Such accuracy suggests considerable forethought, wouldn't you say?" Before the inspector could formulate a response, Mrs. Knight appeared in the doorway, her expression indicating that she bore news of some import. "Begging your pardon," she said, "but I thought you should know that Mr. Robert has been asking questions about the events of yesterday afternoon. Specifically, he's been inquiring about who might have been in the potting shed before the party." Lady Bantry frowned. "How very odd. Why would Robert be interested in such details?" "I couldn't say, my lady, but he seemed quite particular about the timing. He mentioned something about demonstrating the use of gardening implements to one of the guests, and he appeared concerned about whether anyone might have observed this demonstration." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Slack. "I believe Mrs. Knight mentioned yesterday that Mr. Robert had been showing someone how to light a cigarette using the magnifying glass from the potting shed. Perhaps we might speak with him about this educational exercise." Robert Bantry was located in the billiard room, where he had apparently been attempting to distract himself from the previous day's tragedy through the therapeutic clicking of ivory balls. His usually cheerful demeanor seemed somewhat strained, and he greeted the small delegation with obvious nervousness. "Aunt Dolly, Inspector," he said, straightening from his shot with elaborate casualness. "I trust you're making progress with the investigation. Dreadful business, of course. But I suppose these old houses can be treacherous." "Indeed they can, Mr. Bantry," Inspector Slack replied. "We're trying to establish a complete picture of yesterday's events. And we understand you were demonstrating the use of gardening equipment to one of the guests before the party began." Robert's laugh sounded forced. "Oh, that, merely showing off, I'm afraid. You know how it is with young people, always eager to impress with pointless tricks and demonstrations." "And who was the recipient of this demonstration?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Miss Shaw, as it happens. She expressed interest in the various tools Mr. Sims uses for garden maintenance. So I thought I'd show her how the old magnifying glass could be used to light cigarettes and such." Purely educational, you understand? Miss Marple's needles clicked with particular satisfaction. How very instructive. And did Miss Shaw seem particularly interested in the practical applications of concentrated sunlight? Rather more than I expected, actually, Robert admitted. She asked quite specific questions about the intensity of the focused beam and how long it might take to heat various substances. I assumed it was professional curiosity, her being a garden designer and all. Inspector Slack made careful notes while Lady Bantry observed her nephew with growing concern. Rupert, you don't think this demonstration could have any connection to poor Mr. Stratton's accident, do you? Good Lord, I hope not, Rupert replied, though his expression suggested the same possibility had occurred to him. Though I must say, Miss Shaw seemed remarkably knowledgeable about the physics involved. She knew exactly how to position the glass for maximum effect, and seemed quite familiar with the principles of optical concentration. Miss Marple requested permission to examine the magnifying glass again, and the small party made their way to the potting shed. Mr. Sims was working among the roses nearby and joined them with obvious reluctance, his professional pride still smarting from the previous day's implications about his maintenance standards. In the bright morning light, the evidence that had impressed Miss Marple the day before was even more apparent. The leather sleeve of the magnifying glass showed distinct finger marks, where someone had gripped it firmly, and there were traces of what appeared to be the same waxy substance she had found elsewhere. "Mr. Sims," she said, examining the glass carefully. "When did you last use this particular tool?" "Been a week or more, miss," the gardener replied. "Haven't had need of it recently, what with the weather being so fine and no particular pest problems requiring attention." Miss Marple held the glass up to catch the morning sun, watching as it focused the light into a brilliant point of concentrated energy. "Quite remarkable how intense the heat becomes, isn't it? I imagine one could affect various substances with such focused light." She moved the glass experimentally, noting how the focused beam created a small circle of intense heat wherever it was directed. When she aimed it at a scrap of paper lying on the workbench, the material began to smolder within seconds. "Most effective," she observed. "I wonder, Inspector, whether you've examined the scene of yesterday's accident for any evidence of concentrated heat application." Inspector Slack looked uncomfortable. "The examination was primarily concerned with the structural failure of the masonry, Miss Marple. We weren't looking for evidence of, well, deliberate heating. Perhaps a second examination might prove illuminating," Miss Marple suggested mildly, "particularly of any waxy residues that might have been affected by concentrated sunlight." As they prepared to return to the terrace for this additional investigation, Miss Shaw appeared at the entrance to the kitchen garden, carrying what appeared to be a professional camera and several pieces of equipment. "Good morning," she called out brightly, though Miss Marple noticed a certain tension beneath her cheerful manner. "I hope you don't mind my returning again, Lady Bantry. I realized I'd forgotten some of my equipment yesterday, and I wanted to take a few final photographs of the gardens before—" She trailed off, apparently realizing that any mention of future plans might seem inappropriate given the circumstances. "Not at all, Miss Shaw," Lady Bantry replied, though her tone lacked its usual warmth. "Though I'm afraid the terrace area is still being examined by the police." Miss Shaw's gaze moved to the magnifying glass in Miss Marple's hands, and her expression showed a flicker of what might have been recognition or concern. "Still investigating the accident?" she asked. "I would have thought the cause was fairly obvious. These old stone structures can be quite unreliable, especially in hot weather when the materials expand and contract." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, "though we're discovering that yesterday's events may have involved rather more sophisticated engineering than simple thermal expansion. The application of concentrated heat to specific materials, for instance, can produce quite predictable results when properly calculated. Miss Shaw's face paled slightly, though she maintained her professional composure. "How very scientific of you, Miss Marple. I hadn't realized that garden accidents required such detailed analysis." "Oh, but they do," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "especially when they involve such precise timing and positioning. The coordination required suggests considerable expertise in both optical physics and structural engineering." As she spoke, Miss Marple noticed a curious detail about Miss Shaw's gloves. The leather showed traces of a greenish powder that looked remarkably like the verdigris that forms on old bronze fittings. It was exactly the sort of residue one might expect from handling the metal clamps that secured stone urns to masonry balustrades. Chapter 7. Mortar. Chipped yesterday. The revelation about the verdigris on Miss Shaw's gloves had clearly unsettled the garden designer, though she maintained her professional facade with admirable determination. Miss Marple observed her carefully, noting the subtle signs of stress that betrayed themselves in small gestures and forced conversation. "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested diplomatically, "we might continue our examination of the terrace while Miss Shaw completes her photographic work. I'm particularly interested in the remaining evidence from yesterday's structural failure." Inspector Slack, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the investigation, reluctantly agreed to this more detailed examination. The small party made their way to the Italian terrace, where the absence of the fallen urn created a conspicuous gap in the symmetry of the balustrade. Mr. Sims had accompanied them, his professional pride demanding that he defend his maintenance practices against any implied criticism. "I tell you again," he declared firmly, "those urns were solid as bedrock when I checked them 2 days past. I tamped fresh mortar around the base of that very piece myself." Miss Marple approached the remaining eastern urn first, examining its secure attachment to the stonework. The mortar here was indeed fresh, showing the careful attention that Mr. Sims brought to his craft. The bronze clamps that secured the marble base to the balustrade were firmly seated and showed no signs of recent disturbance. "Your work is exemplary, Mr. Sims," she said approvingly. "The contrast with the western mounting is quite remarkable." She moved to the gap where the fallen urn had stood, studying the damaged stonework with the methodical attention of an archaeologist examining ancient ruins. The mortar here showed clear signs of recent disturbance, but not in the pattern one would expect from gradual deterioration. "Inspector," she called, "could you examine this bronze clamp housing? There appears to be something rather interesting about its condition." Inspector Slack bent to study the metalwork, his expression growing increasingly grave as he observed what Miss Marple had discovered. Beneath the remaining lead clamp was a tiny but unmistakable chisel mark, fresh enough to show bright metal where the tool had bitten into the bronze. "Someone's been working on this," he said slowly. "This isn't weathering or natural failure. This is deliberate tampering." Miss Marple nodded with satisfaction. "Quite so. And if you examine the border beneath, you might find additional evidence of this unauthorized maintenance work." A careful search among the plantings revealed what she had expected: a thin chisel wrapped in oiled cloth, hidden beneath the trailing stems of a climbing rose. The tool was of professional quality, with a narrow blade designed for precision work on metal and stone. Mr. Sims examined the chisel with obvious displeasure. "This isn't from my set," he declared emphatically. "My tools are properly maintained and stored, and they're all accounted for. This belongs to someone else entirely." Inspector Slack compared the chisel blade to the fresh mark on the bronze clamp, confirming that the tool was indeed capable of producing such precise damage. The oiled cloth bore traces of verdigris, suggesting recent contact with the corroded metal fittings. "Most illuminating," Miss Marple observed. though I suspect we'll find that this particular implement belongs to someone with professional expertise in garden construction and design. Miss Shaw, who had been photographing the rose beds nearby, looked up sharply at this comment. Her camera case, Miss Marple noticed, contained a leather tool roll of the type used by professionals who required portable precision instruments. Miss Shaw, Inspector Slack said, his tone becoming more official. I wonder if you could show us the contents of your equipment case. We're trying to identify the ownership of this chisel. The garden designer's composure finally began to crack. I'm sure I don't know why you would suspect my tools of being involved in an accident. My equipment is used solely for surveying and design work. Nevertheless, she opened her leather case with obvious reluctance, revealing an assortment of measuring devices, drawing instruments, and small hand tools. The tool roll contained several chisels of various sizes, all carefully maintained and properly secured in their individual pockets. Miss Marple examined the collection with interest. Such professional equipment, she commented admiringly, though I notice there appears to be one space unoccupied in your tool roll. A narrow chisel, perhaps, of the type used for detailed metalwork. Miss Shaw's face flushed, but she maintained her defiant stance. Tools get mislaid in the course of professional work, Miss Marple. I'm sure the missing piece will turn up eventually. I'm sure it will, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. In fact, I believe it already has. The examination of the urn's mounting revealed additional evidence of systematic sabotage. The marble base showed a clean wedge-shaped notch, as if a small supporting element had been carefully removed. The cavity was precisely sized and positioned to create a critical weakness in the urn's stability. Most telling of all was the discovery of a small depression in the stone where something had been temporarily attached with what appeared to be beeswax. The depression was exactly the right size for a thin metal pin, and traces of the waxy adhesive remained in the deepest part of the cavity. Quite ingenious, Miss Marple observed, studying the evidence with professional appreciation. Someone created a timing mechanism using nothing more than garden materials and basic physics. The pin held the urn in precarious balance until the wax softened enough to release it. Inspector Slack was making detailed notes and measurements, his earlier skepticism replaced by grim determination to understand the full scope of the crime. But how would they control the timing? How could they ensure the wax would soften at precisely the right moment? Miss Marple smiled with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student had asked exactly the right question. By using the most reliable timepiece available, Inspector, the sun itself, focused through optical equipment, and timed by the garden's own sundial. She gestured toward a nearby ivy vine where careful examination revealed more evidence of the murderer's preparations. Several leaves showed the characteristic browning she'd noticed the previous day, but here the pattern was clearer. A concentrated beam of light had passed close enough to singe the foliage without actually setting it ablaze. The focal point was calculated with considerable precision, she continued. The magnifying glass was positioned to direct sunlight onto the beeswax at exactly 4:30, when the sundial shadow would indicate the optimal timing for Mr. Stratton's speech. Miss Shaw had grown increasingly pale during this explanation, her professional composure finally abandoning her entirely. She sat heavily on a nearby garden bench, her camera forgotten in her lap. It was supposed to be empty, she said quietly, the words seeming to escape without her conscious volition. The development was going to proceed regardless. Stratton was going to announce it whether Lady Bantry agreed or not. He had already secured preliminary agreements from other estate owners in the area. Lady Bantry stared at her in shock. Other estates? But what has that to do with Gossington? He was creating a consortium, Miss Shaw continued, her voice growing stronger as the confession gathered momentum. a comprehensive development scheme that would transform the entire district. If Gossington refused to participate, they would simply build around it, destroying the property values and forcing eventual capitulation. Inspector Slack stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his handcuffs. Miss Shaw, I must caution you that anything you say may be used in evidence against you. But Miss Shaw seemed beyond caring about legal niceties. I spent 3 years developing the design proposals for this project. 3 years of my life, my reputation, my professional future. When I learned that Stratton planned to award the commission to another firm once the agreements were signed, I realized that all my work would be stolen without credit or compensation. Miss Marple looked at her with something approaching sympathy. So you decided that if Mr. Stratton could not be reasoned with, he could at least be prevented from completing his betrayal. I told myself it would be justice, Miss Shaw replied bitterly. He was destroying people's lives for profit, stealing their work, manipulating them with false promises. Someone had to stop him. Inspector Slack moved closer, but Miss Marple raised a gentle hand to forestall any immediate arrest. There were still aspects of the crime that required clarification, and she suspected that Miss Shaw's confession would prove more complete if she were allowed to finish her story without interruption. Chapter 8. Alibi Sims. Inspector. Slack's notebook had filled rapidly with details of Miss Shaw's confession, but professional thoroughness demanded that he verify the timeline of events and examine the alibis that had been offered by all the guests present at yesterday's fatal gathering. Miss Shaw, he said, settling himself on a stone bench facing the distraught garden designer. I need you to account for your movements yesterday afternoon, particularly in the period leading up to Mr. Stratton's speech. Miss Shaw dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, though her tears seemed as much from frustration as remorse. I had been moving about the gardens all afternoon, taking photographs from my portfolio. The light was particularly favorable for capturing the architectural elements of the terrace. And at what time did you position the optical equipment? Miss Marple inquired gently, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm despite the gravity of the confession. Around 4:30, Miss Shaw admitted. I needed time to calculate the precise angle and ensure that the focused beam would reach the target area at exactly 4:30, where Mr. Stratton was scheduled to speak. Lady Bantry, who had been listening with growing horror to this methodical description of premeditated murder, found her voice. But surely someone must have observed you making these preparations. The terrace and gardens were full of guests. I had been photographing various aspects of the gardens throughout the afternoon, Miss Shaw replied with bitter irony. No one pays particular attention to a professional going about their business. I simply appear to be documenting the estate's features from my design portfolio, Inspector. Slack consulted his notes from the previous day's interviews. Several guests mentioned seeing you near the sundial area around 4:25. The string quartet leader specifically remembered you speaking with him about the musical selections. Miss Shaw's composure cracked slightly. I needed to establish my presence in a different location when the accident occurred. The quartet was rehearsing pieces for the evening entertainment, and I simply asked about their repertoire. But the leader seemed uncertain about the timing, Miss Marple observed. He mentioned that your conversation took place just after 4:25, not during that period. Details become confused in moments of crisis, Miss Shaw said defensively. People remember conversations occurring when they want them to have occurred, not necessarily when they actually took place. Inspector Slack was less inclined toward charitable interpretations. According to my notes, you claim to be with the quartet choosing music from 4:25 until 4:35. That would have provided you with an alibi for the crucial period, when the urn fell. Miss Shaw's shoulders sagged in defeat. It was a desperate improvisation. I hadn't anticipated how carefully the timeline would be examined. Miss Marple sat down her knitting and regarded the confession with the thoughtful expression she wore when solving particularly complex puzzles. I'm curious about the placement cards. Miss Shaw, when did you prepare those, and how did you ensure that Mr. Stratton would position himself in exactly the right location? The cards were prepared that morning, Miss Shaw admitted. I arrived early, ostensibly to take photographs in the better light, and used the opportunity to place the positioning markers. I told several guests that Lady Bantry had requested specific arrangements for photographs during the speeches. But Mrs. Pike moved the cards, Lady Bantry pointed out. She specifically mentioned switching your card with Mr. Stratton's because she felt I should have the place of honor. Miss Shaw's laugh was devoid of humor. Another contingency I hadn't anticipated. I spent several anxious minutes repositioning the cards while pretending to adjust photographic compositions. I told Mrs. Pike that the lighting was better for Mr. Stratton in the central position. Inspector Slack was building a comprehensive picture of the crime's execution, so you repositioned the cards, set up the optical equipment, tampered with the urn's mounting, and established a false alibi, all while maintaining the appearance of normal guest behavior. The planning took weeks, Miss Shaw said quietly. I studied the garden's layout, the path of the sun at different times of day, the structural vulnerabilities of the terrace stonework. I even researched the thermal properties of different types of wax to ensure the timing would be precise. Miss Marple nodded with something approaching professional respect. Quite thorough, though I wonder how you gained access to make the preliminary preparations. Surely Mr. Sims would have noticed unauthorized work on the urn mountings. I had been visiting Gossington regularly over the past month, supposedly to develop design proposals for both the trust and the development options. Lady Bantry was kind enough to allow me extensive access to study the grounds. Lady Bantry's face reflected her sense of betrayal. I welcomed you into my home, encouraged your interest in preserving Gossington's character. How could you use that trust to plan such a terrible thing? Because Mr. Stratton was going to destroy everything anyway, Miss Shaw replied with sudden vehemence. He cared nothing for the historical significance or architectural integrity of these properties. His development scheme would have turned Gossington into a suburban wasteland, and he would have profited handsomely while discarding everyone who had contributed to his success. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a decisive snap. Miss Shaw, I am arresting you for the murder of Lionel Stratton. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence. As he began the formal caution, Miss Marple observed the other individuals present, noting their various reactions to the confession and arrest. Robert? Bantry appeared genuinely shocked by the revelation that his innocent demonstration of the magnifying glass had provided crucial information for the murder plot. His usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by obvious distress at his unwitting contribution to the tragedy. I had no idea, he said repeatedly. She seemed so interested in garden maintenance techniques. I thought I was being helpful, showing her how the tools worked. Mrs. Knight, ever practical, had already begun considering the household implications of the revelation. Shall I prepare a guest room for Inspector Slack's use while he completes his investigation, my lady? I imagine there will be considerable paperwork and formal procedures to manage. Mr. Sims stood near the damaged balustrade, his professional pride vindicated, but his satisfaction tempered by the circumstances. 30 years I've maintained these grounds, he said grimly. Never thought I'd see deliberate sabotage in Lady Bantry's gardens. As Miss Shaw was led away, she paused to look back at the Italian terrace, her expression reflecting a complex mixture of regret and defiance. It was meant to be justice, she said quietly. Someone had to stop him from destroying beautiful things for profit. Miss Marple watched the small procession disappear into the house, then turned her attention back to the damaged stonework. Despite the resolution of the crime, several aspects of the case continued to intrigue her methodical mind. "Dolly," she said thoughtfully, "I believe we should examine the sundial more carefully. I suspect Miss Shaw's calculations were rather more sophisticated than she's admitted. And there may be additional evidence of her preparations. The sundial would indeed prove to hold final secrets about the precision with which this garden murder had been planned and executed." Chapter: The Sundial at 4:30, with Miss Shaw now in custody and the immediate crisis resolved. Miss Marple found herself drawn back to the sundial with the persistent curiosity of someone who appreciated precision in all its forms. The ancient timepiece stood silent in the afternoon sun, its bronze gnomon casting a sharp shadow across the weathered stone face that had marked the hours at Gossington Hall for over 2 centuries. Lady Bantry, still shaken by the morning's revelations, accompanied her friend with the subdued manner of someone whose faith in human nature had been severely tested. "I simply cannot understand how I failed to see what was happening under my own roof. Jane." Miss Shaw seemed so genuinely interested in preserving the garden's historical character. "My dear Dolly," Miss Marple replied gently, settling herself on the circular stone bench that surrounded the sundial. "Deception is often most effective when it masquerades as virtue. Miss Shaw's apparent dedication to architectural preservation provided perfect camouflage for her true intentions." Inspector Slack had remained at Gossington to complete his investigation, and now approached the sundial with the methodical determination of a man who had learned to appreciate the value of thorough documentation. "Miss Marple, you mentioned that the sundial played a crucial role in timing the murder. Could you explain exactly how Miss Shaw used it?" Miss Marple rose and approached the sundial's face, studying the Roman numerals and the precise positioning of the gnomon. The beauty of using a sundial for criminal timing, Inspector, lies in its absolute reliability. Unlike mechanical clocks, which can be fast or slow, the sun's position is mathematically predictable. She gestured toward the shadow cast by the bronze pointer. "At exactly 4:30 yesterday afternoon, this shadow would have fallen across the IV marking. Miss Shaw would have calculated this position weeks in advance, ensuring that her optical equipment would focus sunlight onto the beeswax at precisely the moment when Mr. Stratton was scheduled to speak." Lady Bantry studied the ancient timepiece with new understanding. But surely she couldn't have been certain that the speech would begin at exactly 4:30. Such events rarely proceed according to schedule. But she had taken steps to ensure the timing, Miss Marple explained. The placement cards were designed not merely to position Mr. Stratton correctly, but to encourage prompt adherence to the announced schedule. By suggesting that the positioning was for photographic purposes, she created social pressure for punctuality. Inspector Slack examined the area around the sundial more carefully, searching for additional evidence of Miss Shaw's preparations. Among the flagstones surrounding the base, he discovered several small marks that might have indicated measuring points or equipment positions. "These scratches appear deliberate," he observed, pointing to faint marks on the stone. "They form a pattern that suggests someone was taking measurements or establishing sightlines." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. Miss Shaw was nothing if not thorough in her calculations. She would have needed to determine the exact angles required to focus sunlight from the potting shed area onto the terrace balustrade. To demonstrate her theory, Miss Marple requested that they retrieve the displaced cloche from the kitchen garden. When it was brought to the sundial area, she positioned it carefully according to the faint marks Inspector Slack had discovered. "Now," she said, "if we could borrow Mr. Sims's magnifying glass once more." The head gardener, who'd been observing these proceedings with professional interest, fetched the optical instrument from the potting shed. Under Miss Marple's direction, he positioned it at the height indicated by the singed ivy leaves they had discovered earlier. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The curved glass focused the afternoon sunlight into an intense beam that projected directly toward the terrace balustrade. At exactly 4:30, as measured by the sundial's shadow, the focused light would have struck the precise point where the beeswax had secured the timing pin. "Remarkable," breathed Lady Bantry. "It's like a giant clockwork mechanism powered by the sun itself." Miss Marple smiled with satisfaction. "Miss Shaw created what one might call a garden clock, my dear. Not one that strikes the hour, but one that melts away a crucial component at exactly the predetermined moment." Inspector Slack was documenting the demonstration with photographs and measurements, building a comprehensive record of the murder method. The precision required would have demanded considerable knowledge of optics and engineering. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. Miss Shaw's professional training as a garden designer would have included understanding of sun angles, seasonal variations, and the practical applications of light and shadow in landscape architecture. She simply applied this knowledge in a most sinister fashion. The demonstration complete, they carefully repositioned the equipment and made their way back to the terrace, where the gap in the balustrade served as a stark reminder of the previous day's tragedy. Robert Bantry had been waiting for them, his expression still troubled by his unwitting contribution to the murder plot. "Aunt Dolly," he said hesitantly, "I've been thinking about my demonstration with the magnifying glass. Should I have realized that Miss Shaw's questions were suspicious?" Lady Bantry regarded her nephew with sympathy. "My dear boy, you couldn't possibly have known that someone would use such innocent information for criminal purposes. Miss Shaw deliberately cultivated the appearance of professional curiosity." Miss Marple considered the young man's distress thoughtfully. "In my experience, Mr. Bantry, criminals often succeed precisely because they exploit the natural helpfulness and trust of decent people. Your willingness to share knowledge was admirable, not foolish." Inspector Slack cleared his throat diplomatically. "If I might say so, sir, your information about the demonstration has proved crucial to understanding the crime. Without your testimony, we might never have connected the optical equipment to the murder method." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Gossington's gardens, the small group reflected on the extraordinary complexity of the crime that had been committed in their midst. What had initially appeared to be a simple structural accident had revealed itself as an elaborate conspiracy involving precise timing, sophisticated physics, and ruthless determination. "I suppose," Lady Bantry said eventually, "that this settles the question of Gossington's future. After such events, I could hardly proceed with any development scheme." Regardless of its merits, Miss Marple looked across the formal gardens with their centuries of careful cultivation and their testament to the enduring beauty that human hands could create when guided by love rather than greed. Perhaps this tragedy will ultimately serve to preserve what Miss Shaw claimed to value. Sometimes the most important victories come at the greatest cost. The sundial continued its ancient function, marking the passage of time with the same mathematical precision that had made it such an effective instrument of murder. But now it would resume its proper role as a guardian of garden hours, measuring moments of peace rather than plotting destruction. Inspector Slack gathered his evidence and prepared for the formal proceedings that would follow, while Miss Marple quietly packed away her knitting, satisfied that justice had been served and truth revealed through patient observation and logical deduction. Chapter 10. Terrace, Wax Lens, and a Falling Urn. The following morning brought a clarity to Gossington Hall that seemed to reflect the resolution of the previous day's mysteries. Inspector Slack had completed his formal procedures, and Miss Shaw had been transported to await trial, leaving behind a household still coming to terms with the elaborate deception that had unfolded in their midst. Miss Marple had remained overnight at Lady Bantry's invitation, partly from friendship, and partly from her desire to ensure that all aspects of the case were properly understood. She found herself once again on the Italian terrace, this time accompanied by the full household and Inspector Slack, who had requested a final review of the evidence before closing his investigation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Inspector Slack began, consulting his comprehensive notes, "I believe it would be beneficial to summarize exactly how this remarkable crime was planned and executed. Miss Marple has been instrumental in uncovering the truth, and I think we all deserve to understand the full scope of what occurred." Lady Bantry nodded gravely. "Indeed, Inspector. I confess I'm still struggling to comprehend how such an elaborate scheme could have been carried out under our very noses." Miss Marple settled herself comfortably in a garden chair, her knitting already in motion, and regarded the assembled company with the gentle authority of a teacher addressing an attentive class. The method, my dear friends, was both ingenious and diabolical in its simplicity, she began. Miss Shaw created what one might call a delayed action mechanism, using nothing more sophisticated than garden implements and the laws of physics. She gestured toward the gap in the balustrade, where the fallen urn had stood. The preparation began weeks before the garden party. Miss Shaw used her legitimate access to Gossington to study the structural details of the terrace, the path of the sun at different times of day, and the vulnerabilities of the urn mountings. Mrs. Knight listened with rapt attention, the rapt attention of someone whose professional domain had been violated by criminal intent to think she was planning murder while I was serving her tea and showing her the household arrangements. The actual sabotage was accomplished in stages, Miss Marple continued. First, she loosened the bronze clamps that secured the urn to the balustrade, using her professional tools to chip away strategic portions of the metal fastenings. Then she carved a precise wedge-shaped notch in the marble base, creating a fulcrum point that would allow the massive urn to tip with minimal force. Robert Bantry, still troubled by his unwitting contribution to the scheme, interjected quietly. But how did she control the timing so precisely? Surely she couldn't predict exactly when the urn would fall. Miss Marple smiled approvingly at the question. "Ah, but she could, Mr. Bantry, and that's where your innocent demonstration of the magnifying glass became crucial to her plan." Miss Shaw inserted a thin metal pin into the wedge notch, held in place by a small quantity of beeswax. This pin temporarily prevented the urn from tipping, creating a sort of safety catch. Inspector Slack took up the explanation, referring to his detailed diagrams of the mechanism. On the day of the party, Miss Shaw positioned the garden cloche and magnifying glass to focus sunlight onto the beeswax at precisely 4:30, as determined by the sundial shadow. When the concentrated heat softened the wax sufficiently, the pin dropped, the wedge shifted, and the already compromised urn began its fatal descent. Mr. Sims shook his head in professional admiration, despite his moral disapproval. 30 years I've worked with these gardens, and I never would have thought to use the sun itself as a timer. Diabolical clever? I'll grant her that. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The beauty of the scheme, from Miss Shaw's perspective, lay in its apparent impossibility. Who would suspect that a structural accident could be timed to the minute using garden equipment and astronomical calculations? Lady Bantry studied the remaining urn with new appreciation for its potential as a weapon. But surely the positioning of Mr. Stratton was crucial to the plan's success. She couldn't have been certain he would stand in exactly the right location. Indeed, and that's where the placement cards became essential, Miss Marple explained. Miss Shaw prepared these cards in advance, ostensibly for photographic purposes, ensuring that Mr. Stratton would be positioned directly beneath the compromised urn when he gave his speech. Inspector Slack consulted. his notes about the timeline when Mrs. Pike inadvertently switched the cards. Miss Shaw had to improvise quickly, repositioning them while pretending to arrange photographic compositions. Several witnesses observed her moving about the sundial area just before the speeches began. The assembled company contemplated the extraordinary complexity of the crime, each person reflecting on how they had been manipulated without realizing it. The physical evidence tells the complete story, Miss Marple continued, withdrawing several small items wrapped in handkerchiefs. The beeswax residue found under the urn's plinth and on the displaced cloche, the singed ivy leaves that marked the path of the concentrated light beam, the fresh chisel marks on the bronze clamps made with tools from Miss Shaw's professional kit. She displayed the placement cards with their telltale eraser marks. The handwriting analysis confirmed that Miss Shaw had prepared and repositioned these cards to ensure Mr. Stratton's fatal placement. Inspector Slack added grimly, and the verdigris traces on her gloves provided final proof that she'd been handling the corroded bronze fittings recently. Lady Bantry looked around her beloved gardens with a mixture of sadness and relief. I suppose I should be grateful that the truth emerged so quickly. To think that poor Mr. Stratton died because Miss Shaw felt betrayed by his business practices. 3 years of design work, Miss Marple observed quietly. Stolen without credit or compensation. Professional theft, one might call it, though hardly justification for murder. Robert cleared his throat awkwardly. Aunt Dolly, what will you do about Gossington now? Surely this business has settled the question of development schemes. Lady Bantry straightened her shoulders with something of her old determination. The National Trust, I think. Miss Shaw was right about one thing, much as I hate to admit it. Beautiful places deserve protection from those who would destroy them for profit. Miss Marple smiled with gentle satisfaction. Perhaps some good will come from this tragedy. After all, Gossington will be preserved for future generations to enjoy, and its gardens will continue to mark the seasons with sundials rather than plotting destruction. As the group prepared to disperse, each returning to their normal routines after the extraordinary disruption of the past few days, Miss Marple took one final look around the Italian terrace. It occurs to me, she said to Lady Bantry, that this may indeed have been your last garden party as a private hostess, but it need not be your last party at Gossington. The Trust will surely welcome your continued involvement in the estate's future. Lady Bantry's expression brightened considerably. You're quite right, Jane. Gardens forgive more readily than people, and there will be many more seasons to celebrate here. The sundial continued its ancient function, marking the passage of peaceful hours in a garden where justice had been served and truth revealed through patience, observation, and the gentle persistence of an elderly lady with knitting needles and an uncommonly sharp eye for human nature.